please do. But otherwise, let's have some questions. So I've got Simon on his toes because he wasn't expecting that because I flipped it around. Questions for Clarion at the end, please. I have pain in my body every day, neck, shoulders, either side of my spine. I'm aching, stiffness, nothing seems to help. Doctors think it could be fibromyalgia. Is this related to trauma, stress, the past? Yes. Normally, it's not something, I'm not a doctor, so I can't replace what your doctor says. And I'm also not an osteopath. I'm a trauma therapist. And this kind of pain is generally quite psychosomatically related to how we're holding ourselves relative to our history. So there's a lot that you can do. If you think about, you're actually going to have a fantastic lecture in this series of classes. There's a wonderful, one of the teachers, Saida, is going to be doing a specialist lecture in the vagus nerve because that's her area. And the vagus nerve is very related to the whole thing with fibromyalgia. She may not go towards that question, but when you start to understand how we hold contracts in our body, how we hold our history in our body, and actually how most of our suffering is our rejection of that. So how can I begin to heal this process? I would say have a look at a very good book called The Body Keeps the Score. So maybe Simon or Carrie, who are monitoring this, they could write that up there, The Body Keeps the Score. So that's a great opening question. Are there any other questions out there? And I think you might be allowed to unmute yourself to ask me questions if you want to. So let's do it. When we've grown up being shamed, sometimes I still shame unintentionally. How do we teach our children rules with more love? That's a really good. Hi, Yusha. Nice to have you here. Yeah, when we have shame, we do shame. If we have been shamed, we will shame. And it's absolutely the truth. A lot of our safety mechanisms will be rooted in rejecting other people or making other people feel ashamed and therefore keeping us with some distance and some safety. I think that it takes time to work out how to speak to children without shaming them or threatening them or pushing them outside their comfort zone. And I don't think that's a simple question to answer here, but I do intend to do more workshops on communication. I ran a very good workshop recently. I mean, I know it was good because it went very deep and the responses were very useful. There's a workshop series coming up called The Great Anxiety Hack. And one of the episodes is literally about communication, how we communicate and how we can be aware of what we signal and what we're saying and doing in our communication. So that is that. Now, Simon's concentrating. So Simon, do you want to take over questions? Because I can't have you sitting there looking quite so lovely and not actually doing anything. I'm assuming you've got to know Simon. Simon's excellent. So Simon, you're going to take over my questions. Go on.
Okay, they've just unmuted me. Fantastic. All right.
So I got to Usha.
Get to Usha. Okay. From Angie, what would you see the most important tools to have in your healing trauma release toolkit? So what would
That's a really good question. That's a really good question, because do you remember, if you were there for the introduction, and you might not have been, but when I opened the event after Stuart's breathwork this morning, I talked about having a notebook. It's worth having a notebook with you today and on all the days, because you're going to have some amazing tools given to you by all of us, actually. Everything that we teach in terms of breath and warm up is a tool. I'm going to go into a lecture in a moment with a short yoga series as well about the instinctual self. And when we're stressed and anxious or trying to release this traumatic body, we want to pay attention to how we're thinking. I'll explain that a bit more over the days. So if we're thinking in a contracted way, so if our thinking is that you're left out, that you're abandoned, that you're isolated, that you're jealous, that you're oppressed, you're offended, if your thinking is in any way negative or stressed, or that you've somehow been forgotten, then you're in your stress system. And so the tools would be things like the breath. Stuart taught some really excellent breaths for releasing that system. Tools would be things like stretching. Tools very much, which is where Trish is excellent, are things like gratitude, the awareness of gratitude. And it is about, the hardest part is to notice when you're triggered. You might know you're triggered, but quite often what we do is we just think, fuck it, I'm just going to be triggered, and then I'm just going to be horrible, or I'm going to do whatever it is I normally do. And part of the art of the journey into transformation is actually to recognize that you're triggered and choose to stop it. I mentioned this in my introduction. How do you deserve to change how you feel? Because we get very addicted in a way, in a funny way. We feel more comfortable when we're stressed and anxious because we know it. We know it very well. For some people, to be soft and comfortable and relaxed with the brain still is actually quite stressful. So this is why yoga gradually helps change that relationship. So stretching, breathing, drinking cold water, running is brilliant. You know, it doesn't always have to be yoga, but there's a lot that comes up over this workshop that will be really, really helpful. That's a great question. Thank you, Angie. Simon, back to you.
Okay, thank you. So from Julie, I believe addiction is a result of trauma. So if you say heal the trauma, do you believe one could successfully say drink again?
That's such a naughty question. It's such a naughty question. And it's actually one I get asked a lot. So yes, I consider myself to have done an enormous amount of work on my own story, and my own story informs obviously how I teach and why I teach. And I would say that if I found myself walking towards wanting to drink or take drugs again, I would wonder what the fuck was going on. Why do I need that? The reason we've called this series This Life Divine is actually because a life without the drugs, a life without the alcohol, a life without the gambling, a life in a sense of presence and expansion is an extraordinary thing. So I would say that if you heal your trauma, you're a very different person. And if you find yourself wanting to drink or take drugs, I would certainly ask myself, what am I missing? What is coming up that this is what I need to do to myself? So I would say healing the trauma wouldn't make it that you can drink again. No, I think that's an opportunistic way of thinking. It's a great question, though. Thank you.
And the next one from Christine, can you talk about how memory can be affected by trauma?
I don't really understand the question, but let me presume that the question means that you don't remember a lot of your childhood, or you don't remember a lot of what happened. If you don't remember a lot of what happened when you were using, it may well be dependent on what you were using. You know, if you have a very high alcohol or marijuana or LSD or any number of drugs will really affect your memory. But if you're talking about childhood memories, one of the things that happens in the body, and I teach this in longer workshops, I'll teach you a short version of it, is that when you're very, very stressed, so if you grew up with a lot of stress and anxiety, whether it was your stress and anxiety or whether it was projected onto you or whether you were in a stressful and anxious environment, when you're under pressure, particularly when you're young, your brain shuts down because of the stress hormones. The vagus nerve takes you, so the vagus nerve, we've already mentioned the vagus nerve. Saida is going to go into it in more depth, but your stress hormones shut down your neocortex. Your neocortex is the lovely big part of your brain. You know, when you think about a brain, you kind of think of this big fluffy pink thing or gray thing. That's your neocortex. That's what it's called, neo, because it's the new brain. And the neocortex kind of says, oh, do I want a new iPhone? Do I need an iPhone 12? Maybe I do. Do I need a bigger one? Or do I want to go to the cinema? Did I think that was funny? Do I want to build a huge building? That's your neocortex. Underneath your neocortex is actually what we're going to deal with today, which is the safety-seeking aspect of your brain, which if you know anything about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you could say that underneath your brain is the part of your brain that looks for danger all the time. And for some people, it's on all the time. This is what anxiety is. This is what self-harming disorders are. This is what generalized anxiety is. This is shame. This is addiction. Is this part of the brain is on overdrive and it can't manage what's going on. So when you're little, when that part of the brain, the safety-seeking part of the brain is hyper aroused, the stress hormones shut down access to the neocortex. And so the brain doesn't process information in the same way, and you tend not to remember. It's a very complex trauma therapist answer to what could be a simple question, but it's not a simple question. A lot of people don't remember stuff from their childhood because they were too stressed. One of the things that can happen if you take on longer term recovery, whether you work with a therapist or you use different forms. There's all sorts of different ways that you can work with the recovery. Memories do start to come back. You start to allow your brain allows things to be processed, but you'll never remember everything because your brain isn't like that anyway. You won't be able to remember anything generally pre-3 either, because that's not what the brain does. I don't know if that was clear. Simon, was that clear?
That was very clear.
Okay, good.
Very relatable.
Okay,
thank
good.
you. So much, sorry, from Simon, so much of what has been said seemed to come back to love. And this is what I felt a lack of, love for myself and for others. How do we re-find love and learn to find or foster love if you're coming from a place of deficit?
That's a very nice question. I was talking, I can't remember if it was this morning or yesterday. I talk a lot. I was talking about a book called Belonging by Tucker Poe, a book about belonging, which talks exactly about this in a slightly simpler way than I would normally talk about it. It's an interesting book by a Jungian therapist who specializes in dreams. And she wrote a book about belonging and how when you find yourself abandoned, forgotten, unloved, filled with shame, I think the interesting thing about having this anxious, addictive nature is that what we do is we throw ourselves off. We throw ourselves into what I call the hinterland. What I call the hinterland is a liminal space, which means it's a kind of dream space where we think we're the only ones down there. And we think that we're the only people who've been through what we've been through. We're the only people who feel this separate and this alone. But the truth is that the hinterland as a space, which I work in the transpersonal, lots of big words, it's just filled with people who think they're the only people down there. But the problem is they've all got blinkers on and they can't see anyone else. So it's really interesting. What we do here, the 11 of us who are teaching you on this particular round, is that we are helping you and hoping that maybe you can find within yourself a community of people. It's like when I run an addiction week-long training. Everybody comes thinking they're on their own. And literally within the first day, everybody realizes that they're all dealing with the same issues. This is the issue that is there with trauma, shame, abuse, addiction, and self-harm and anxiety, is this sense of separation. So the first job is to begin to love yourself. And sometimes what we find particularly interesting at the moment in lockdown with Zoom and yoga, those of us who are yoga teachers have discovered that we're capable of creating extraordinary connections. We're capable of creating extraordinary groups that really are supportive and loving and actually really there. And it's a very lovely thing to come online and see all those people. So you've got great teachers over these 3 days who are all really capable of holding and creating community. And a lot of us, will be there when I'm teaching at Tri Yoga. You'll see very similar people. And we end up forming this extraordinary group of people where we are change makers and we're actually learning that we can change how we feel. And in that, we create connection. So it's a difficult thing to think about creating connection in COVID because it feels counterintuitive. But these groups, these environments, this landscape of let's move through this stuff, let's work together, let's all pull. Imagine we're all pulling, or we're all rowing a boat together. All of the teachers here have had the same suffering in different forms. And we can all relate to each other. Everybody's here because they're human, and we're all here because of our humanity. And actually, that's an extraordinary connector. Again, a long answer to a great question. I'm going to take from Simon, I'm going to take 2 more questions. Then I'm going to give the lecture, and then I'm going to teach the series, and then I'll take some more questions if there's time. But great. Thank you, Simon. Good question.
Sure. And I'm just going in order here. From Naive, I have gone through relationship trauma over the last year with a narcissist. I'm still working through it, but I'm still in contact with him. These last few months, I've relapsed in my eating disorder or binge eating, and I've started having physical symptoms like hair loss and more anxiety than I've ever experienced. What would you suggest would be the best tools to start with? Thank you so much.
Gosh. As a therapist, I work quite interestingly with, there's always a perfect match. The narcissist will always find the empath, or I'm going to use a word which you might find really offensive, but as a therapist, it's what I work with, which is the borderline. And what you're talking about is having given up one addiction for another. So in French, it means a vase communicant, whereas if this was your addiction was to this person, as that goes down, other addictions come up. So this is one of the things that we want to look at when we get into looking at changing our behaviors, is starting to pay attention. Let's imagine, let's use a mushroom. There's a mushroom growing, like a lovely field mushroom. Pick that mushroom, another one comes. Pick that one, another one comes, until eventually they get smaller and smaller, and you're kind of on it. And, you know, my thing might now, after all these years, be coffee. I like coffee twice a day. But bit by bit, what you want to do is choose behaviors that support you in life and health. And so sometimes as you're walking towards a behavior or the connection with this person that you're describing as a narcissist, you might want to think, is this communication or is this habit supporting me in life and health? And if it's eating disorders and self-harming disorders, one of the first ways to do it is to make more safety for yourself. So find ways to make yourself feel safer. So you've got to notice, when are you not safe? And the other thing to do is to take maybe 15 minutes, say, okay, I'm not going to act, I'm not going to ring them, or I'm not going to text them, or I'm not going to eat that thing. I'm going to go and do something else. I'm going to take 15 minutes. I'm going to stretch. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to go for a walk. And you start to create safe distance and spaces. And then you discover that actually you can. Maybe you could do half an hour next time. Maybe you could do an hour. And then actually, maybe after the hour, you might think, I don't care anymore. So it's about supporting yourself. So in a way, coming back to the previous question, which I think was asked to me by Simon, but it was written by a Simon. It's about connecting to yourself. It's about actually loving yourself. It's about not needing that other person to validate you, or also if you're still triggered and traumatized, sometimes we use other people to trigger us into our trauma. So we create this perfect storm around us of people that trigger us. So you might notice that that's what you're doing. So I think, Simon, have I got one more question?
You do. And the last question from Sarah, and there's a question regarding anxiety. What advice do you have to help our partners and friends and family understand our anxiety or make space allowance for it? How can I best share my anxiety without making them feel guilty or responsible or attacked, etc.?
That's a huge question. I think we have a tendency to blame. We generally use anxiety either to be given space, you know, like, let's imagine as a parent, let's imagine, you know, I might be going, oh God, I'm really anxious, you know, and then one of my children might go, shh, mommy's really anxious, leave her alone, you know, and then one of them might come in and go, mommy, can I make you a cake? You're gonna fuck off. We use it as a way of making space. We use it as a way of manipulating other people into caring for us. So if you're stressing out your family by your anxiety, quite often we can be very punishing in our anxiety. This is where the shame is repeated. What I might say is take a break from your family, do some work on your anxiety, get yourself a little bit more comfortable with a sense of safety. And then rather than ever making it about anyone else, if you ever have to talk about how you feel, only talk about how you feel, rather than saying, because of you, or because of what you did, I feel. It's about being able to say, I get quite anxious and I need to take some space, or I feel quite uncomfortable right now, so I'm going to take a distance. It's about owning and not blaming. And I think that's quite difficult when we're anxious. We tend to want to assign blame, and we tend to hope that somebody's going to come in and make it better. And then we get upset if they don't. It's not really anyone else's. I'm assuming you're an adult. So if you're an adult, it's not anyone else's job to look after your anxiety. And if you've got a screaming inner child having a temper tantrum because they're not, that's the part you need to take care of. So again, you might want to find a therapist that can help you do inner child work. And please, everybody, I'm fully booked. I'm not scavenging for clients at all. Trust me, I'm not. Simon, that was great. I think we've got way more questions than we'll ever be able to answer. But I want to talk, first of all, before I teach a short series. So let me do that. And maybe let's go forward from there. So I'm going to stop looking at questions. But thank you. They were great questions. So hopefully you've all had something to eat. Now, when I teach, I run a workshop called Mastering the Addictive Personality, or A Path Out of Hell. And it's an evolving workshop. It's a pretty interesting experience of the self. It's equivalent to about 1,500 hours of therapy. If you are wanting to take steps forward in your understanding, it's didactic. So I work as a therapist, but when I'm a yoga teacher, I'm also teaching you to understand what you're doing. So it's a unique way of working. And as a therapist, I'm also allowed to be directive, which means that I can ask you questions and make suggestions, give homework. That's how I work. So I'm not one of those therapists that sits there and goes, that must be really painful, and that's it. So as a teacher, I'm really interested in helping understand, particularly through posture and breath work. It's very easy to understand. So When I run a week-long workshop, I split it up into 3 parts. And the first is the roots of addiction or anxiety or self-harming behaviors. So looking at what happened and exploring what happened. So I do that in a much longer, I spend 2.5 days on a workshop exploring what happened, not asking people to eviscerate their story, but looking at the effects of story that can happen, and then people can do what they want with the information. So day 1 of this workshop looks at that, the roots of what happened. And I'm going to teach a series, a short series, depending on how long it takes me to get to teach it. It's called the instinctual self. And the instinctual self is what I was talking about earlier on. It's, if you know about Maslow's triangle, it's our need for safety. There's a part of us that can only really function properly if we have food, water, and a sense of safety. And we have, and actually going back to that thing, we have the beginnings of a sense of belonging. So if we've thrown ourselves into the hinterland, if we're constantly recycling our trauma, what a lot of people do, what a lot of us do, is we have a traumatic history. We hate how it makes us feel. That gives us permission to act out. So we use our traumatic story to give ourselves permission to behave badly. So this is a perfect triangulation, a perfect movement where we keep ourselves stuck. And when you finally arrive on the mat and you finally start working with the breath, it's a really interesting thing to discover that you own a system in your body that is continuously trying to find safety because it's traumatized. So the traumatized brain and body, they're generally in a state of contraction. The mind and the physical body, everything is short. The mind is programmed to be dealing with the pain of the past and the fear of the future. And how that reports in your body is that your body is primed. It means it's ready to want to escape all the time. So it means that you're existing within a body that's in a state of hyper arousal, checking all the time, checking for safety. This neocortex, you know, some of us are high functioning trauma. I remember when I was towards the end of my using, I was one of the best body painters in the world. I could manage insanely mad jobs. I was doing things like Freddie Mercury pop videos and Natrel videos. Probably doesn't mean anything to you now, but at the time they were monster jobs. I mean, they were huge. The number of assistants I had, the number of people, the size of the job. But at the same time, I could function. But at the same time, my behaviors were really self-harming, were really addictive. And also for me, I was very secretive. So a lot of the stuff I did alone. So not somebody sort of sharing. So when I first got clean and sober, everyone was going, how mad, you can't be a drug addict, you can't be an alcoholic, you don't, and truth is nobody knew what I was doing. So what happens is that the brain and the body are constantly trying to find safety. So what we do when we're in that state is we abandon ourselves. This is a lot of what we're talking about, particularly in that question about love and connection. We can't cope with how we feel, so we have to bring something in, and that something might be very simple. It might be social media. It might be, somebody mentioned their narcissistic relationship. It might be the narcissistic other. It might be shopping. It might be gambling. It might be risk behaviors, either to do with gambling or money, or to do with debt, or even to do with jumping off cliffs for the thrill. We could be using drugs, alcohol, we could be self-harming, we could have an eating disorder. And I know self-harming and eating disorders sit under the same umbrella, but I always separate them because people's brains work with them differently. But when we're in our instincts, we're literally only trying to make ourselves safe. So we're constantly abandoning this small hurt child part of ourselves. Or the moment anything gets tricky, we sort of sit back and say, here, child, small version of Carolyn, you decide. And the child goes, I don't know what to do. And you behave like you did when you were 3 or 5 or 7, depending on what was going on. A good way to relate to that is to think, how old do you feel when you're anxious? I know some of you will be funny and say 100, but actually most of you will say 5, 7, 4, 8. You'll name very, very young ages about how you feel when you're anxious. And also, how old do you feel when you're angry? Most people will be naming 11, 12, 15, because that's where we hit being able to separate ourselves energetically from our parents. From 7, we can reject our parents. We start to be able to think differently and we access anger. So the instinctual self is all about safety. And the safety is a child safety state. It's not an adult safety state. If you think about, I'm feeling really stressed, I'm going to make a decision to eat a liter of ice cream. It's not an adult decision. If you think about, I'm feeling really ashamed, I'm going to cut myself. That is not an adult decision. That's a child decision. That's a desperate attempt to try and change how you feel. When you think about, I'm feeling really lonely, I'm going to go and buy heroin. They're not particularly adult decisions. And what we want to do is to be able to come out of the instincts. And how do we come out of the instincts is a really big and interesting question. What we learn through breath and posture, and when you give the teacher permission to help you change how you feel, you begin to learn that you can actually stop the feelings. You can stretch, and the stretch will change how you feel. You can hold your breath and tighten the muscles in your body, and you'll get a dopamine rush. Dopamine is the hormone of connection. So coming back again to that love question, we have these extraordinary tools, and we can come to yoga with a very religious eye. We can view yoga as if Shiva has made us better, but we can also take responsibility for, let's say, doing something like Cobra, which is in this posture that I'm going to teach in this sequence. Cobra is a posture that goes into the body and invites you, follow me. So curl up on the exhale, just curl up. And as I bring your hands up your body and roll your shoulders open, imagine that you're coming into Cobra and you push back and you raise your chin and you exhale and you close your eyes and you come down. Just notice you've just done, boom, there's a dopamine rush. You've just gone into all your contracts and you've just said, hold on a minute, maybe I'm okay. It's a bit like you've said to the safety system, stand down. You've said to the instinctual self, hang on, hold fast, stop for a moment. So this is what we're looking at when we look at the body through the lens of yoga and pranayama. And what I do is I'm an embodied psychotherapist. So I can say to somebody who might be having a panic attack, let's imagine I'm with a client and they're about to have a panic attack. I might say, hold on, do you want to have the panic attack, or should we stop the panic attack and let's discuss what was happening? And the client might go, what? Well, you don't have to have the panic attack. If you stretch, the panic attack will go away. So then maybe the client will stretch. And then maybe there's that thing of, oh my God, I didn't have to do that. So we have here what we're playing with. We're playing with this extraordinary possibility that you could own your system. So when we look at the instinctual self, when we look at the instincts, we're looking at the stress system. And the stress system is generally called the autonomic system. And autonomic is a really interesting word. Autonomic means that you have no control. It means that it works by itself. It works without your agency, which means you don't get to change it. This is how we've been brought up to believe. So it's a very limiting belief system, because science and doctors until the last 10 years or so said you can't change it. But actually, you can change it hugely. I could be sitting here and I might be really stressed. I'm not, because I'm doing what I know I can do. But if I was feeling really stressed and if I stretched, so let's open the series, let's stretch, interlock your hands. This is how I always teach, and several people here will take you through this. You can't get enough dopamine. This is going to give you dopamine. This is going to release the vagus nerve. It's going to land you, even if it's only for a moment. You might instantly stress yourself again, and that's okay. So interlock your hands, pull your hands apart, keep breathing, raise your chest, keep breathing, raise your chin, and then that glorious moment as your elbows go back and come up, take a long, deep inhale. Hold the breath, turn as far as you can to one side, including your head, and exhale. Come back, inhale. Hold the breath, turn as far as you can to the other side, including your head, and exhale, and then come down. And roll your shoulders. Your hands come either into prayer pose or crossed on your chest. Now, from here on, if you're pregnant, I'm going to ask you not to do my class, because there's too many changes and every single posture is wrong if you're pregnant. So just enjoy yourself if you're pregnant. So take a long, deep inhale otherwise. Hold the breath. Squeeze the anus, the sexual organs, and the belly. Flare the ribs, tighten under the ribs, tighten the neck, drop the chin. Long, deep exhale. These are the body locks. Holding the breath out. Squeeze the anus, the sexual organs, and the belly. Flare the ribs, tighten under the ribs, tighten the neck, drop the chin. Long, deep inhale. Hold the breath, pull the locks. Long, deep exhale. Hold the breath out, pull the locks. And inhale. Take a moment and bow forward to whatever relationship you may or may not have, with the possibility that you are exquisite and extraordinary from the inside. So the opposite of shame. Inhale up. Bow forward to whatever you may or may not relate to as an external divine force. Inhaling up and bowing forward to an extraordinary time that allows us to explore so much and yet at the same time takes away so much. So just take a moment, close your eyes, and just be gentle. You might notice that you've done a series of things that have gone in and reset your system, but you may also not find it very easy to close your eyes. You may need to have your eyes open. Notice that tells you, lets me tell you, that perhaps you're hypervigilant, perhaps your system is over alert. When we did that stretch, we went into the autonomic system and we said, it's okay. It's really interesting. Just notice, it's okay. You're okay. It's a very lovely thing, that very soft, gentle voice that says, it's okay. And the invitation over these days is to begin to be able to do that to yourself. So the instinctual self is the part of ourselves that's constantly looking for danger and for stress. And it's this hyper vigilant sense of a lack of safety. The truth is, my job is to repeat myself 1,000 times. That's my job. I'm a therapist. Takes time. You have a safety mechanism that says, don't you dare switch me off. Don't you dare believe what she's saying. And that's okay. It takes time. You begin little by little to notice, and little by little, you change your behaviors. That's how it works. Little by little, you put things down and behaviors change. So today, as we look at the roots of addiction, this hyper aroused state generally comes from 9 types of abuse, 3 routes to trauma. And if your background was things like boarding school, depressed or divorced parents, loss of a parent, abandonment, all of these things, adoption, they will all create very hyper-aroused stress systems. And in truth, most people who come to yoga because they are struggling and suffering. And I want to say one last thing, which is that I really do define addiction and anxiety and self-harming disorders. They really are about suffering. I really don't subscribe to the disease model. So just so you know, that's my background, is that I don't work with the disease model. I work with shame, abuse, and trauma as being the roots to addiction and anxiety and self-harming disorders. And when you start learning to make safety for yourself and to take care and to be kind and to say to yourself, it's okay. That's the beginning of transformation. So during this program over the next 3 days, I'd like, even if it isn't said to you, slowly, carefully, and gently. Those are the 3 words. Do the opposite of what you came from in your history. Be slow, be kind, be gentle to yourself all the way through. And as much as possible in class, keep your eyes closed, unless you need your eyes open for balance. See if you can make your yoga mat the most exquisite place on the planet. So